On the cold day of February 9th, 1959, in the lively city of Montreal, Canada, a girl named Sharon Kim Pryor was born. Her parents, Yvonne and George Pryor, were overwhelmed with joy at the arrival of their first child. Yvonne, who was born in England, had moved with her parents to settle in Point St. Charles, known locally as the Point, a neighborhood in the borough of Lessus, West, in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. There, she met George, a devoted soldier in the Canadian Armed Forces. Despite his commitment to his work, love blossomed, leading to their marriage. Elated by their union, Yvonne and George looked forward to the arrival of their first baby. Their excitement peaked on Sharon's birthday when they welcomed a beautiful daughter into their lives. Sharon's innocent face and bright smile filled her parents with joy, but fate had more surprises for the Pryor family. Just a day before Sharon's second birthday, on February 8, 1961, Yvonne gave birth to twin sisters, Doreen and Maureen. To little Sharon, they were the perfect birthday gift she could have ever dreamed of. However, life is full of twists and turns. And in 1962, George received transfer orders that would uproot the family from Point St. Charles to Manitoba. In their new surroundings, the Pryor family welcomed their youngest addition, George Jr. But alas, even the strongest bonds sometimes fray. And in 1965, Yvonne and George decided to part ways. Yvonne, now a resilient single mother, returned to her beloved Point St. Charles. Yvonne's decision to return to the Point was not arbitrary. It was a deliberate choice rooted in love and practicality. The neighborhood, with its affordable living and tight-knit community, promised a safe haven for her children to thrive in. From an early age, Sharon exuded a gentle, caring nature that extended to the world around her. Animals found solace in her presence as she often took in strays, tenderly nursing them back to health. Her twin sisters Doreen and Maureen often reminisced about Sharon's dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Sharon, initially reserved, discovered a welcoming community that embraced her. The Boys and Girls Club provided a space where her interests thrived, particularly through her active involvement in floor hockey and artistic pursuits. In the midst of their teenage years, Sharon discovered solace in the presence of a young man named John. Their love story held a touch of destiny, as John had been Sharon's secret crush since the fourth grade days. As time passed, their friendship deepened and blossomed into a profound romance. Sharon also had a close-knit circle of friends, whether it was roaming the streets of Point St. Charles, discovering hidden nooks and crannies, or gathering at the local hangout spot to revel in carefree conversations. Their bond was unbreakable. Through it all, Sharon remained grounded and appreciative of her mother, Yvonne, who had selflessly devoted herself to the well-being of her children. Sharon recognized the sacrifices her mother had made and cherished the unwavering love and guidance she provided. On the eve of Easter, Saturday, March 29, 1975, 16-year-old Sharon Pryor's day unfolded with a sense of anticipation. As the clock struck 1 p.m., Sharon had begun her Easter weekend by completing her morning routine: breakfast, washing up, getting dressed, and tidying her bed. Meanwhile, her mother Yvonne headed out for some last-minute Easter dinner shopping. Jojo, Sharon's 11-year-old brother, and Stephen, the 4-year-old foster child, were still eager to search for Easter eggs. Sharon wanted to make the day extra special for them. With creativity in mind, Sharon decided to make and paint Easter eggs. She boiled 8 eggs and left them cool. At 3 p.m., Yvonne returned home and joined Sharon at the kitchen table, watching her paint the eggs. Sharon asked if the paint would dry in time for the next day. Yvonne suggested painting half the eggs in the cups and finishing the rest later. Around 3:45 p.m., Sharon realized it was time to pick up her Leo Boys jacket from the Boys and Girls Club. The Boys and Girls Club provided opportunity for children to play in a variety of sports from basketball to hockey without it costing the families anything. And when it started in 1952, the association consisted of 2 teams made of 30 or more children, and every child got a green Laos jacket that was earned through selling raffle tickets. Sharon had sold enough raffle tickets to get her very own jacket. Excited, she asked Yvonne if she could take Stephen with her. Yvonne agreed, and off they went. Unfortunately, when Sharon arrived at the club, they did not have her size. Disappointed, she received a receipt to claim it another day. She thought about getting a smaller size for Steven since he needed a fitting spring coat. On her way back, she dropped off her friend's jacket. Back home by 4:15 p.m., Sharon continued painting the remaining Easter eggs. Then around 4:30 p.m., the Reverend paid a visit to their home. He greeted them and brought them a large box of chocolate turtles for everyone to enjoy. They gathered around the kitchen table, and while Sharon painted, she asked her mom if they had a book about the Easter Bunny to read to Steven. The Reverend suggested that Sharon share the true story of Easter, and she gladly accepted the opportunity. Between 6 and 7 p.m., Sharon's close friend, who happened to live in the same block as her, arrived at her house. They had known each other since they were both 5 years old, forming a deep bond over the years. Despite their long-standing friendship, they didn't frequently spend time together with Sharon's group of friends, likely due to attending different high schools. As Sharon excitedly shared her plans to go to Marina's pizzeria, they indulged in lighthearted banter and playful teasing. Her friend couldn't help but laugh at the amusing sight of Sharon, constantly changing her tops and scrutinizing herself in the mirror, striving to achieve that perfect look. Ultimately, after much deliberation, Sharon decided to borrow one of her mother's tops, adding a touch of familiarity to her ensemble. Marina's Pizzeria, a local hangout located on the corner of Wellington and Ash Avenue, held a special place in Sharon's social circle. It served as a popular meeting spot for her friends where they could gather and engage in lively conversation about various topics, such as boys and the latest music trends. The restaurant was conveniently located just 5 short blocks away from Sharon's house. As Sharon prepared to leave, she bid farewell to her mother, who reminded her to be cautious. Worried about the rainy weather, Sharon contemplated whether to wear her brown suede jacket, fearing it might get damaged. Her mother assured her that it was merely drizzling outside and not enough to harm the jacket, alleviating her concerns. With the final goodbye to her mother, Sharon headed out the door, her mother's cautionary words lingering in her mind. Outside, her friend was already waiting on the sidewalk. She kindly offered to accompany Sharon on her walk to Marina's, but Sharon politely declined, appreciating the gesture nonetheless. Crossing the street, Sharon embarked on her journey, excited about the evening of fun and camaraderie that awaited her at the beloved pizzeria. Sharon's friends eagerly anticipated her arrival, but to their surprise, she never showed up. They assumed that she had accompanied John and the other boys they usually hung out with to a hockey game. However, when the game ended and the boys arrived at the restaurant, Sharon was nowhere to be found. In fact, none of them had seen her throughout the entire night. Meanwhile, back at Sharon's home, the situation mirrored the confusion and worry. Sharon had surpassed her curfew without any communication to her mother, leaving her concerned. Yvonne grew increasingly anxious as this behavior was completely out of character for her daughter. Determined to ensure Sharon's safety, Yvonne decided to stay awake and wait for her return. As the clock struck 1:30 a.m., Yvonne found herself positioned in the living room, anxiously peering out the window while the twins from the bedroom window joined in the watchful vigil. Sadly, there was no sign of Sharon. The following morning, Yvonne embarked on a mission to gather information, reaching out to Sharon's friends and even contacting John. However, none of them had any knowledge of Sharon's whereabouts or had seen her recently. The lack of information only deepened Yvonne's concern and heightened the mystery surrounding Sharon's disappearance. During one of the calls, Yvonne spoke with Sharon's friend, Mary, and she shared disturbing information with her. Mary told Yvonne that a woman named Cheryl Waugh had been attacked on Ash Avenue after 7 p.m. Yvonne couldn't help but worry upon hearing this news, as the direction in which the assailant fled could potentially intersect with Sharon's path. Cheryl, the victim of the attack, recounted the terrifying incident. The assailant had brandished a knife and forcibly grabbed her. Fortunately, before he could cause harm, another passerby intervened, scaring off the attacker. Cheryl provided a description of the assailant, mentioning his blue eyes, a mustache with squared corners, and a low, calm voice. She noted that he was wearing blue jeans, a dark blue ski jacket, and black shoes with pointed toes. Learning about this attack heightened Yvonne's anxiety, considering the possibility that Sharon might have encountered the same assailant. To gather more evidence, Cheryl was brought in to identify her attacker, but her certainty wavered, making it difficult to press charges against anyone. Yvonne grappled with the fear that her daughter may have fallen victim to a similar assault. The lack of concrete information and the uncertainty surrounding Sharon's whereabouts only intensified her worry and further emphasized the urgency of finding her. In a desperate attempt to find Sharon, a massive search operation was initiated, mobilizing hundreds of residents who combed the streets, hoping to locate the missing 16-year-old girl. Despite the collective efforts, the search yielded no results. Yvonne, consumed by worry and desperation, took to the television appealing to the community for any information that could lead to Sharon's safe return. Unfortunately, this plea also failed to provide any substantial leads or progress in the investigation. As the days passed, a disheartening sense of uncertainty settled upon everyone involved. Some individuals began to speculate that Sharon may have chosen to run away, but her family adamantly rejected this notion. They couldn't fathom the idea that she would willingly abandon the life she loved, a life encompassing her family, friends, and boyfriend. Furthermore, there were no apparent indications or clues suggesting that Sharon had planned to leave her life behind. Notably, she had left behind her bus pass and money at her family's house before embarking on her visit to the pizzeria. Amidst the mounting despair, Yvonne and her family clung to the hope that Sharon would be found safe and sound. The lack of progress in the search and the absence of concrete information only intensified their anguish, leaving them yearning for answers and closure. On April 1st, 1975, at around 6 a.m., Yvonne Pryor noticed Ronnie knocking on her friend's door across the street early in the morning. Sensing something was amiss, she approached him, took the newspaper he was holding, and quickly returned home. Yvonne couldn't resist the urge to unravel the truth within the pages. As she opened the newspaper, her worst fears were confirmed. She recognized the picture of her daughter. She uttered with certainty, "I knew it was her. I knew her shoes." The photograph displayed a body lying in the snow, discovered in Longwell Field, a city approximately 25 minutes away from their neighborhood. Devastated by the news, Yvonne immediately contacted the police to seek confirmation. Although she was too distraught to personally identify the body, instead she entrusted her brother with the painful task. Ultimately, it was confirmed that the body found was indeed Sharon. The entire community in the Point, including her friends, came across the story in the newspaper, and like Yvonne, they were convinced of the tragic truth. Sharon's life had been brutally taken. Sharon's body was discovered by Jacques Beltran, a beekeeper. Jacques had received word that the gate to his apiary had been left open, which was highly unusual. Recalling that he had locked it the night before, he proceeded to investigate. To his surprise, he stumbled upon a partially nude body lying in the snow, approximately 75 feet from the road. Immediately recognizing the gravity of the situation, Jacques promptly contacted the police, marking the beginning of a harrowing investigation. Sharon's murder was a horrifying and brutal act of violence. She had been subjected to assault and severe beatings. When her body was found, she was only wearing her suede jacket, a blue sweater, socks, and shoes. Her jeans were discovered a short distance away, while her underwear was found hanging from a nearby tree branch. Disturbingly, partially chewed tape was entangled in her hair, and tightly clenched branches were grasped in her hand, indicating that she had been alive when her assailant left her in the snow. Examining the scene, investigators uncovered several pieces of crucial evidence. Around 15 feet from the body, tire tracks were found indicating the presence of a vehicle. Additionally, a blood trail was observed leading from the parked car to where Sharon's body lay. The absence of drag marks and the lack of mud on Sharon's shoes and socks suggested that she had likely been carried out of the car, leading authorities to suspect the involvement of more than one person due to the apparent ease with which the task was executed. In close proximity to the body, a man's shirt with a size 17 collar and 34-inch sleeves was discovered, believed to have been used as a binding for Sharon's wrist. The size of the shirt led investigators to speculate that the suspect was approximately 6 feet tall. Not far from the crime scene, an imprint of a right shoe, size 8.5, was found next to a gate post. The depth of the imprint indicated that the person responsible may have had a heavier build and must have been at least 6 foot tall. Further evidence included a ring with the word love inscribed on it, a page from an English magazine featuring a young girl, a gun, a car seat cushion, and a receipt for a jacket bearing the name Sharon Pryor. The subsequent autopsy revealed that Sharon had been held captive for days before her death. The estimated time of her demise was approximately 20 hours prior to the discovery of her body. The coroner's examination exposed a crushed chest, possibly from the killer kneeling on it, resulting in internal hemorrhaging. Sharon had sustained injuries consistent with the use of a pointed object, such as a ring with multiple bruises on her face, fractures on both sides of her jaw, a broken nose, and a hole in her cheek, possibly caused by a loose tooth during the assault. On April 4, 1975, a somber gathering took place at St. Matthew's Presbyterian Church, as approximately 200 mourners gathered to bid farewell to Sharon Pryor and pay their final respects. The atmosphere inside the chapel was heavy with grief and sorrow as friends, family, and members of the community came together to mourn the tragic loss of a young life. The mourners, deeply wounded by the cruel fate that had befallen Sharon, joined in solidarity to offer their support and condolences to her grieving family. The chapel was filled with a mixture of tears, heartache, and profound sadness as they grappled with the pain of losing someone so young and full of promise. During the service, memories of Sharon were shared, capturing her vibrant spirit, cherished moments, and the impact she had made on those around her. The eulogies and tributes served as a poignant reminder of the void left behind her untimely departure. As Sharon was laid to rest, the weight of the tragedy and the senseless act of violence that took her life hung heavily in the air. After the missing person report was filed, the investigation into Sharon's abduction and murder was commenced by Detective Sergeants Jacques Duet-Rieuse and Renaud Lacombe from the Longueuil Police Department. The detectives developed a theory that the killer had driven the vehicle onto the field and disposed of Sharon's body there. They believed that the killer had returned to the vehicle to retrieve Sharon's jeans and underwear, which were found in different locations the same day as when her body was discovered. The heavier jeans had fallen to the ground, while the underwear ended up on a tree branch. This led the investigators to speculate that the killer was familiar with the local area. The field where Sharon's body was discovered belonged to a beekeeper and was usually padlocked. However, the padlock had been left unhooked, allowing the killer to drive their truck onto the frozen ground. Although the vehicle got stuck in the mud at one point, the frozen mud left behind tire tracks that the police hoped to use to identify the killer's vehicle. The remote location of the crime scene was believed to have been chosen because the field would not be used by the beekeeper until late spring. It appeared that the killer had expected Sharon's body to remain undetected in the frozen field for an extended period. Based on the evidence, the police suspected the involvement of more than one person in Sharon's abduction and murder. They found a trail of blood leading from the tire tracks to where Sharon's body had been dumped. Since there was no mud on Sharon's shoes, it was deduced that she had been carried the entire distance of 15 feet, possibly by 2 individuals. One theory considered by the detectives was that Sharon had accepted a ride from someone, possibly a passing trucker, on her way to the restaurant and had been attacked and left in the field. Another theory proposed that Sharon had been abducted and held captive for 3 days before being killed and her body being disposed of. Greg McCreary, a profiler who had worked with the FBI, dedicated his efforts to developing theories surrounding the Sharon Pryor case. Through his analysis, McCreary formed several conclusions about the attacker. He believed the perpetrator to be a younger individual, possibly in his 20s, who was likely residing in the local area with his parents. McCreary also posited that this wouldn't have been the attacker's first offense. He likely had prior experience. Additionally, McCreary suggested that the same assailant who attempted to harm Cheryl could very well be the person responsible for Sharon's murder. He explained that when killers enter their hunting mindset, they become more inclined to take risk, such as committing a second abduction. McCreary considered the probability of 2 separate individuals intending to abduct women simultaneously in the same small low-crime area to be statistically unlikely. Therefore, it seemed more plausible that the attacker was the same in both cases. The The profile further emphasized that the attacker's familiarity with the area, particularly the disposal site, since these locations are considered high risk. The assailant would have needed to know the exit points and choose a place that was familiar and provided comfort. McCreary also identified signs of sadistic behavior in the attacker, such as holding the victim captive for days aligned with the sadist pattern. Understanding this pattern could potentially assist in narrowing down the list of suspects. McCreary explained that sadists typically seek compliant victims within their social circle. They initially appear nice and charming, particularly to vulnerable young women. Over time, they become increasingly demanding, exerting control and eventually resorting to degrading and violent behavior. Once compliant victims are no longer available, they may turn to escorts or individuals known for being strange or violent. When even that avenue is exhausted, they resort to hunting strangers. Based on his analysis, McCreary advised the police to investigate individuals with a history of minor domestic arrest or solicitation, as they could potentially fit the profile of Sharon's killer. He also noted that the assailant on the street, who used a knife to try to abduct Cheryl, lacked strong interpersonal skills. This indicated that the attacker knew he couldn't manipulate her with sophisticated deception and resorted to violence instead. The wounds found on Sharon's face further suggested that her killer lacked the skills necessary to maintain control, leading him to rely on violence. McCreary concluded that since the abduction seemed to be carried out by a stranger, the perpetrator would likely be classified as a serial offender. Serial murders of this nature rarely cease their activities on their own, making it crucial to pursue an aggressive investigation to bring the killer to justice. The Longville Police Department, grappling with the investigation into Sharon Pryor's brutal murder, harbored concerns that her tragic death might be connected to the killings of other girls. One such murder was of Norma O'Brien, a 12-year-old girl who had been found lifeless in a field near Chattagoy the previous summer. Norma had suffered assault and mutilation, and like Sharon, she had died as a result of asphyxiation. Approximately a year later, the disappearance of 14-year-old Debbie Fisher intensified the police's worries. Debbie had set off on her bicycle from her uncle's residence, intending to reach her family's home just 10 minutes away. However, she never arrived, prompting an immediate investigation by the authorities. Her disappearance occurred in close proximity to where Norma O'Brien had vanished the year before. Tragically, Debbie Fisher's lifeless body was discovered in an abandoned car in the woods. She had been brutally beaten with a rock. While Sharon Pryor's case remained unresolved, a breakthrough occurred in the investigation into Debbie Fisher's murder. The police were able to apprehend a suspect, a minor who was only a few years older than Fisher herself. Due to a publication ban, the public was restricted from knowing the killer's identity, and he was referred to as simply MX. The perpetrator served his time in prison, but was eventually released. The unsettling connection between these tragic cases highlighted the deep concern within the community and law enforcement about a potential serial killer operating in the area. Despite interviewing 38 individuals in connection with the case, including suspects like Frank Daly, also known as Jerry Moore, the manager of the pizzeria, and several individuals associated with him, as well as beekeeper Jacques Beltran, his co-owner Roger Augrey, and Raymond Ahmed, the owner of the adjacent property. The police were unable to gather sufficient evidence to bring charges against anyone. Even Sharon's close friends and boyfriend were interviewed, but no breakthrough emerged from these inquiries. As time passed, leads dried up and information ceased to come in. Despite the confidence in the evidence collected, the case eventually went cold, leaving Sharon's murder unresolved. In the year 2000, Yvonne wrote a letter to the police requesting a review of evidence in Sharon Pryor's case. Yvonne hoped that the advancements in technology could shed new light on the investigation. However, her request was denied a week later, as the police had discarded the majority of the evidence in 1995. This news left Yvonne feeling hurt and distraught, but she persisted in asking the police to locate Sharon's clothing, which fortunately had been preserved. The clothing was analyzed, and finally, the police obtained a DNA sample that did not match Sharon's. In July 2004, the police received a tip regarding a garage space where Sharon might have been held captive. The garage was situated behind an apartment building, and the hope was to find some of Sharon's DNA for further investigation. 3 samples were collected, but unfortunately, none of them matched Sharon's or the profile of her murderer. An update in 2012 involved an anonymous donor, increasing the reward to $10,000 and establishing a dedicated phone line for tips. This development sparked speculation among the public, suggesting that new information had surfaced. Another avenue explored was the hypnosis session conducted on the woman who saved Cheryl Waugh, hoping to extract additional details from that fateful day. Following the session, the police presented her with several photos and one man stood out to her. The man in question was William Patrick Fife, a convicted Canadian serial killer responsible for the deaths of 5 women in Montreal, although he claimed to have killed as many as 9. Fife's first known killing occurred in 1979, which didn't align with Sharon's case in 1975. There was no evidence connecting Fife to Sharon Pryor, and it remained unclear if the police had compared DNA or thoroughly investigated this lead. Over the years, amateur investigators have attempted to link Sharon's murder with others and have brought forth alleged confessions. One such confession was mentioned in the book, The Hard Road, by Peter Edwards, which briefly references Sharon's murder and implicates a member of the Montreal Satan's Choice motorcycle club named Mike French. However, these claims and suspects have remained speculative, and no definitive evidence has emerged to support them. Despite the speculation and the various leads explored throughout the years, Sharon Pryor's case remained unresolved, leaving her family and community seeking answers and closure. Between July-August 2019, DNA samples from the suspect at the crime scene, including samples from Sharon Pryor's clothing, were sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a company based in Ruston, Virginia that develops nanopharmaceuticals and provides DNA phenotyping services for law enforcement organizations. The purpose was to get a prediction result from the DNA sample, and the prediction result matched a man with fair skin or very fair skin, green or hazel eyes, brown hair, and a selection to other freckles. Then in June 8, 2022, a significant breakthrough was achieved when Montreal Laboratory analyzed the suspect's Y chromosome DNA in comparison with the Pisces database. The analysis results made it possible to target the priority name Romain or Romaine. Franklin Romain, who had addresses in Montreal and Longueuil in the 1970s, emerged as a potential suspect. The tire tracks found at the crime scene were compatible with the vehicle registered under Romaine's name in Montreal. Franklin Maywood Romaine had an extensive criminal record in the United States and had encounters with the Montreal police. DNA samples were obtained from Romaine's 2 living brothers who willingly provided them to West Virginia police. Both brothers testified that they believed their brother had committed the murder. Family photos depicted Romaine as a tall man with reddish-brown hair and a mustache. Unfortunately, Romaine passed away in Canada in 1982 and was buried in West Virginia. The police have strong reasons to believe that Romaine is the suspect in Sharon Pryor's case. He was living in Montreal at the time of the crime, was familiar with the abduction scene, and matched the witness description. Additionally, DNA analysis indicated a connection between the DNA found at the crime scene and the Romaine family. Romaine also matched the description of a man who had attempted to kidnap Cheryl Waugh at knife point in close proximity to where Sharon Pryor disappeared. Documents filed in court revealed that one of Romaine's brothers confessed that Romaine had attempted to abuse his wife. The analysis of DNA from the Romaine family indicated a strong likelihood of a familial connection to the crime scene DNA. To further investigate the potential link, Romaine's body was exhumed with the consent of the court, despite opposition from his sisters and 2 brothers due to religious beliefs. On May 8, 2023, the DNA from Romaine's remains was being tested at Montreal Laboratory, and the results are expected to be available by approximately May 22, 2023. The new suspect, Franklin Romaine, was not among the more than 100 individuals previously investigated by police in connection with Sharon Pryor's murder. The identity of Romaine as a suspect came as a surprise to the Pryor family's lawyer, Mark Bellemare. Although he had not discussed the matter with the family, Bellemare emphasized the importance of additional information in cases of missing or murdered individuals and expressed hope that this new development would bring some comfort to the Pryor family. The ongoing testing and investigation surrounding Franklin Romaine and the potential DNA match have raised hopes of finally obtaining answers and justice in the unresolved case of Sharon Pryor's murder. The friends and family of Sharon Pryor have been deeply affected by her tragic murder and have shared their thoughts and memories about her. Yvonne Pryor, Sharon's mother, still living in the neighborhood of Point St. Charles, sent a powerful message through a friend, urging all mothers to watch over and love their daughters. Yvonne Pryor, Sharon's mother, shared her feelings with the media and expressed her enduring hope that the person responsible would one day be found. She spoke of Sharon's loving nature, saying, "Everybody loved her. She was just wonderful to be around." Sharon's sister Doreen Pryor reflected on the loss and wondered what her sister's life could have been like. She questioned who Sharon would have become, speculating if she would have pursued a career as a veterinarian, which she had shown an affinity for. Doreen's twin sister, Maureen Pryor, expressed her determination to confront Sharon's killer and unravel the truth. She expressed her strong desire to know the identity of the perpetrator, as well as the details surrounding the incident, emphasizing her need for answers regarding who, what, when, and where. The Pryor family, friends, and the community as a whole had been waiting for answers for about a half a century, hoping for justice and closure in Sharon Pryor's case. While the recent breakthrough brings a glimmer of hope, it is a reminder of the enduring pain and the importance of finding the truth for the sake of Sharon's memory and those who loved her. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Priscilla Lewis encountered numerous challenges growing up in a tough neighborhood in Port Costa, California. Despite these obstacles, she remained determined and ambitious. At just 21 years old, she was diligently saving to purchase her own home. Her cheerful and affable nature served her well in her role as a waitress at Four Corners Pizza and Pasta in Crockett, California. On September 24, 1996, Priscilla was working the night shift at the pizza restaurant. Shortly before closing, Priscilla took her last break. She went to a bar across the street to use the bathroom. While she was there, she ran into her cousin, Troy Kinslow, who was having a drink at the bar. Priscilla then smoked a cigarette outside of the restaurant before going back inside to complete her shift. The cook at the restaurant knew Priscilla was going on a break, but became concerned when she did not return from it and closing time was drawing near. He decided to check the bathroom to see if he could find her. In the bathroom, at approximately 10:30 p.m., he found Priscilla's body. Priscilla had been brutally attacked. She had been beaten, strangled, and drowned in the toilet. Her neck had been broken. While Priscilla had been a very friendly person, her best friend was also positive that she would have fought back against her killer. The restaurant where Priscilla worked was located in the rundown Bologna Square Mall, a former family-owned department store that, in 1996, was home to 4 other businesses in addition to the restaurant. All of the businesses shared a public bathroom in the building's dimly lit basement. The bathroom could be accessed by anyone and 3 staircases led down to the basement. One of the staircases was directly behind Four Corners Pizza. The waitresses at the restaurant did not use the public bathroom because they thought the basement was creepy. They instead used the bathroom at the bar across the street, as Priscilla had done just prior to her murder. This led to speculation that someone had been lying in wait at the top of the staircase and dragged Priscilla downstairs. As she was returning to the police, executed several search warrants, conducted numerous interviews, and submitted pieces of evidence for forensic analysis. However, these efforts did not result in the identification of Priscilla's killer. Investigators did not give up on the case as years passed, however, in part due to the ongoing efforts of Priscilla's family. Priscilla had grown up with Troy Kinslow, the cousin she had seen shortly before she was killed. He had a difficult time dealing with Priscilla's murder and regularly contacted the police in the years following her death, making sure they were still focused on the case. When asked in 2019 what he wanted to say to Priscilla's killer, he replied, "We're going to get you. It might not be today, but these detectives are going to get you, and you're going to have to pay the price." 2 years later, Troy would be proven correct. On December 9, 2021, The Contra Costa Sheriff's Office announced that 51-year-old Danny Lamont Hamilton had been charged with Priscilla's murder the day before, the events that ultimately led to the crime lab for examination. This resulted in DNA evidence being found and a profile being developed. The profile was a match to Hamilton. Hamilton's DNA profile was available to police because at the time of his identification, Hamilton was incarcerated at a state prison near San Diego, serving 295 years for unrelated sexual assault charges. He was initially taken into custody on those charges in 1999, 3 years after Priscilla's murder. Hamilton is being charged with 1 count of murder with 4 special enhancements in Priscilla's case. Priscilla's brother David was understandably disturbed to learn of Hamilton and the nature of his other crimes. He does believe that finally having answers in Priscilla's case will help his family heal, even though the arrest has opened up old emotional wounds that have never fully healed since his sister was murdered. He also hopes that DNA evidence will help solve other cases and provide answers to other families. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. In 1999, Minnie Soriano was a 13-year-old 7th grader at Middle School 135 in the Bronx, where she excelled as a straight-A student. Known for her bubbly and sweet personality, Minnie was both helpful and mature, frequently taking care of her younger sister, Nadia, and handling errands and chores for her mother and stepfather. Enterprising beyond her years, she sold candy to the other residents in her apartment building. A passionate lover of poetry, Minnie regularly wrote in her journals, filling them with her poems, school assignments, personal entries, and letters. On February 24, 1999, Minnie walked out of school with her friend Kimberly after dismissal. They parted ways because Kimberly had to go straight home and Minnie wanted to stop at the library before going to meet her younger sister after she finished school for the day. According to Kimberly, Minnie made a comment about being upset over something, but she did not ask her to elaborate on what was bothering her. Minnie was seen getting onto a city bus, wearing her backpack and a red jacket. At approximately 2:20 p.m., Minnie's routine was to take her bus back to her apartment building and then wait for her sister Nadia's bus to arrive so that she could walk the 7-year-old into the building. That day, she was not there waiting for Nadia. When Nadia gave up on waiting for her sister, she was able to find her way inside to their apartment. When she arrived home alone, her mother was immediately concerned. Minnie was a dedicated older sister who would never have left Nadia waiting outside alone. Minnie's mother and stepfather searched for her themselves before calling police to report her missing. The search for Minnie went on for several days until its tragic conclusion on February 28, 1999. That Sunday morning, a homeless man was going through the contents of dumpsters behind a video store 2 miles away from Minnie's apartment building. He found a particularly heavy black bag and opened it to see what was inside, only to discover Minnie's body. Minnie's body was in the fetal position, bound with green tape and wrapped inside the black garbage bag. The medical examiner did not find evidence of sexual assault, but the district attorney's office would later describe Minnie as being sexually abused, an assertion supported by the semen stains found on the front of the sweatshirt she was wearing. Minnie was found fully clothed, but her jacket and backpack were missing. The medical examiner determined Minnie had died of strangulation as the result of her neck being compressed, possibly while she was held in a chokehold. Minnie may have arrived at her apartment building as usual. A witness came forward reporting seeing her get off at the bus stop near her building on the afternoon she disappeared. Police canvassed the building, hoping to find further witnesses. They also feared that Minnie's killer may be another resident of the building, particularly in light of the fact that she sold candy door to door in the building, raising concerns that someone she met doing this may have developed an obsession with her. The DNA from the semen found on Minnie's sweatshirt was run through a national criminal database in 2000, but no match was found. It would be this DNA that would finally lead to an arrest in Minnie's case more than 22 years after her murder. On November 29, 2021, 49-year-old Joseph Martinez of New Rochelle, New York was arrested for Minnie's murder. The following day, he was arraigned on 2 counts of second murder, felony and intentional, in Bronx Supreme Court and remanded to custody. Martinez had been identified using familial DNA. Familial DNA is perhaps most well known for its use in identifying Lonnie David Franklin Jr. as the serial killer known as the Grim Sleeper in Los Angeles in 2010. The technique is used in cases where a direct match to an unknown DNA sample is not found in criminal databases. It looks for partial DNA matches in these databases instead, trying to identify any relatives of the contributor of the unknown DNA, potentially allowing authorities to greatly narrow down their pool of possible suspects. Binney's case was the first cold case in which the technique led to the arrest of a suspect in New York City. The state of New York had authorized this technique to be used to attempt to identify suspects in criminal cases in 2017. Since then, the state had only approved the use of the technique in just 35 cases. Only 10 of these cases resulted in a match being located. Investigators are required to go through an extensive application process with the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services and the State Police Crime Lab in order to obtain authorization to submit samples for familial DNA testing. Investigators on Minnie's case first sought this authorization in 2018 after the case was re-examined by the Bronx Homicide Squad that February. Between the extensive authorization process and the detailed forensic work required by scientists at the crime lab, it will be 2 years before investigators had a lead to follow. In June of 2020, familial DNA testing identified a now deceased convicted offender in the criminal database as a partial match to the investigators then began looking into his family. Based on the amount of DNA shared by this offender and the man who left his DNA on Minnie's sweatshirt, they believed the man they were looking for was the son of the offender found in the database. Investigators learned that the offender found in the database had 5 sons and began researching to see if any of them could be the killer they were looking for. 2 of his sons were eliminated because of their age at the time of the murder. The lives of the other 3 were closely scrutinized to ascertain if any information, like their location at the time of the murder or any physical impediments, could exclude them as a possible suspect. While re-examining their case files in light of the new information provided by the familial DNA testing, investigators learned that one of the 3 potential suspects had lived in the same building as Minnie and had been interviewed in the early days of the investigation as a part of the canvassing of the building. This individual was Joseph Martinez, who was 27 years old at the time of the murder. Police were able to surreptitiously collect a discarded DNA sample from Martinez. Testing of that sample showed that Martinez's DNA was a match to the DNA from the semen found on Minnie's sweatshirt. Martinez voluntarily met with police to be interviewed about the case. During this interview, he denied ever having physical contact with Minnie. Martinez pleaded not guilty to the charges against him in court and maintained his innocence to the press through his lawyer. He has no criminal record and is the father of 2 daughters. Martinez is a street astronomer who would set up a telescope on the street and give astronomy lessons to passersby, particularly children. He had an active social media presence and was known as Jupiter Joe. According to his website, he had been scheduled to be at a playground in the Bronx with his telescope 3 days after his arrest. In an unsettling coincidence, Minnie had an interest in astronomy. She told some of her friends she wanted to be an astronaut, and one of her journals contains a long list of astronomy websites she liked to visit. When asked about the arrest in his daughter's case, Minnie's father, Luis Soriano Duran, who now lives in Texas, was happy there was finally progress in the case, but sad that it took so long. Everywhere we go, we see a little kid. I remember her. When somebody smiles like she did, it makes me remember her. She always was in our heart and in our mind. I hope that justice will do its work. This time, do it on time and right, he told NBC New York. When asked about the man charged with his daughter's murder, Mr. Soriano Duran replied, "I wish him to go to hell." Martinez is due back in court on March 7, 2022. Mary Romczyk was born in Czechoslovakia in August of 1908 and came to the United States with her family when she was 8 years old. The family settled in Owasso, Michigan, and Mary attended St. Paul's School until she reached the 8th grade when she dropped out, so she could help put her siblings through school. Mary got married in 1951 to a man named Leonard Pryor, and the couple settled in Flint, Michigan. Mary had learned to make candy as a child and added on to her house at Chippewa and Louisa Streets in Flint so that she could open up the Sweet Marie's candy shop. Due to rising violence in Flint, Mary and Leonard eventually decided to sell the candy store and retire. They moved to the small village of Lennon, Michigan, which they believed would be a safer location. Leonard passed away in 1992. Mary remained at their home in Lennon with her beloved dog, Pupsy, who frequently accompanied Mary on her walks. According to her family, Mary was a sweet woman with a wacky sense of humor who was always kind and generous. By 1997, 88-year-old Mary was a creature of habit. She was a devout Catholic who attended Mass 6 days a week and walked to the same diner for lunch and dinner almost every day. Her brother-in-law, James, would give her a ride to church each day. On February 27, 1997, however, Mary was not at her home when he arrived to pick her up. The door to the house was open and her dog Pupsy was still inside, but there was no sign of Mary. James went to the church to see if Mary had just found a ride with someone else, but she was not there. He checked the diner she frequented as well, but could not find her. He reported her missing around noon. Canine teams with the Michigan State Police were luckily in the area at the time for a training exercise and were sent to Mary's house to help with the search for her. Approximately 2 hours after Mary Pryor was reported missing, a state trooper and a canine officer located her body wrapped in a blanket in a swampy wooded area 150 yards away from her house. Mary's autopsy would reveal that she had been suffocated and beaten about the head. She appeared to have been raped, a conclusion later confirmed by DNA evidence. Police spent years conducting interviews and following up on leads, but were unable to make an arrest. Mary was not forgotten by her small community, and billboards were put up and door hangers were distributed to houses over the following decades. Shortly after the murder, the community was able to collect $20,000 to offer as a reward for information that led to the conviction of Mary's killer, but the money was eventually returned to the donors after years passed with no one coming forward to claim it. Just months before the 25th anniversary of Mary's murder, on November 11, 2021, Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson announced that an arrest had been made in the case. 41-year-old Michael Burr of London, Michigan had been charged on single counts of felony murder, first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and kidnapping in connection to Mary's murder. Burr was just 17 years old and a junior in high school at the time Mary was killed. He had long been considered a potential suspect by investigators because his home was so close to Mary's. Sheriff Swanson had been assigned to Mary's case in 2002 when he was a captain with the sheriff's office, and he interviewed Burr as part of his investigation in 2004. A DNA sample was collected from Burr in 1997 and kept in storage, and biological samples from Mary's autopsy were preserved. Other items connected to the case have also been submitted for DNA testing in the years since the murder. While the sheriff's office has had access to Burr's DNA for decades, according to Sheriff Swanson, the DNA match was not made until the day before Burr was arrested. The biological material collected from the crime scene is a 1 in 1.9 octillion match for Burr. Sheriff Swanson has discussed scientific advances contributing to Burr's identification, but it is unclear what those advances are. Because of the ongoing legal proceedings against Burr, the sheriff's office and the prosecutor have only been able to speak publicly about the evidence against Burr in very broad terms, so further details about the DNA match are not available. There is other evidence prosecutors plan to use in court, including drag mark evidence, as well as a witness who provided a statement several years ago and is still available to testify in court. However, like the DNA techniques used in the case, this evidence will only be detailed to the public as the legal proceedings against Burr progress. I didn't think this was ever going to be solved. I just felt that way, and I am so pleased and so happy that Aunt Mary is going to get the justice she deserves. Emily Dubé, Mary's niece, said following Burr's arrest. In December of 1976, 81-year-old George Clarence Seitz resided in the Jamaican neighborhood of Queens, New York. A World War I veteran, the conflict had left a profound mark on him. Had he lived in a time when the condition was better understood, he might have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Extremely reclusive and distrustful of banks, George preferred to carry all his money with him at all times. This meant that on the rare occasions he did leave his house, he would pull out a giant wad of cash, often worth $1,000, to pay for anything he purchased. Around 10 a.m. on December 10, 1976, George left home to walk to Haircutters, a barbershop 2.5 blocks away, to get his haircut. He never returned home. It would be nearly 45 years before authorities learned what happened to George. On November 3, 2021, 74-year-old Martin Mota was arrested and charged with George's murder. The events that led to authorities being able to determine that George had been murdered began more than 2 years earlier. On March 11, 2019, a woman in her 50s called the police to tell them about something she had witnessed back in 1976 when she was 11 years old. According to authorities, she had not come forward earlier because of intimidation and concerns about repercussions. The witness reported that as a child, she had seen her mother's boyfriend cut up a body inside of the barbershop he owned with his brother. The barbershop was Haircutters, where George Seitz got his haircut, and the boyfriend was Martin Mota. The witness further stated that she later saw Mota with black garbage bags, burying them in the backyard. The following day, investigators went to the home where the witness reported seeing the burial at 8772 115th Street in the Richmond Hill neighborhood of Queens. Forensic anthropologists began excavating the backyard and located a makeshift grave in the exact spot where the witness said it would be. The advanced state of decomposition, the remains were found in complicated extracting DNA from them, but the medical examiner was ultimately able to identify a complete DNA profile. By this time, genetic genealogy was becoming a popular tool for law enforcement. However, at the time, New York state law only allowed for genetic genealogy to be used to identify suspects, not victims. The FBI did not have such limitations, so they were brought into the investigation. In February of 2021, the NYPD partnered with Otham Laboratories, who created a comprehensive genealogical profile. The profile was given to the FBI, who generated leads for the NYPD and the Queens District Attorney's Office to follow up on. Potential relatives of the victim were identified in California and Ohio, and investigators traveled to speak with them. The next major break in the case came when they went to Ohio. The individuals they went to speak with were not surprised when a detective from the NYPD came to speak with them and instantly assumed they were there to discuss a relative of theirs they had been searching for over the past 45 years. They explained the story of George Seitz and his disappearance. They also revealed George's habit of always having a lot of cash on him. DNA samples collected from these relatives confirmed that the remains found in Richmond Hill belonged to George Seitz. The family was grateful to finally have answers about what happened to George. With the information provided by George's family, prosecutors were able to present robbery as the motive for the murder when they presented the case to the grand jury that ultimately indicted Martin Mota on a charge of second-degree murder. During the course of their investigation, the NYPD and the Queens District Attorney's Office uncovered what they described as crucial evidence, which they alleged ties Mota to the murder. Their investigation included multiple witness interviews and record searches covering multiple agencies in 5 different states. Mota appeared in court to discuss the possibility of bail. He was remanded to custody and is currently being held at the Anna M. Cross Correctional Facility. His next court appearance is scheduled for December 3rd. Raymond Jones was an outgoing and popular man. He always had a smile on his face and he loved to tease and play jokes. When he met a woman named Betty in the 1950s, they had many common interests like dancing and fishing. The two began spending all their time together, engaged in all the activities they both loved. The couple married and had 3 children together. Their one son, Jeffrey, shared Ray's birthday of September 7th. Betty and Ray also loved racing stock cars, but this shared interest would ultimately tear them apart rather than keep them together. Betty was in a serious wreck, and while she survived, she was left paralyzed from the waist down. The stress of her serious injury put a strain on the marriage, and Betty and Ray ultimately divorced. The couple's children stayed with their mother at their home in Montana, while Ray moved to Salmon, Idaho. He got remarried to a woman named Donna, and the couple adopted a little boy. Ray became very close with his neighbors, the Pearson family, and the Joneses and the Pearsons spent a lot of time together. Raymond would practice shooting with his friend, Ralph Pearson, and would play tricks on Ralph's young children. Ralph Pearson would be the last known person to see Ray alive. Ray spent his 39th birthday, September 7, 1968, out bow hunting with a hunting party that included Ralph as well as 2 other hunters. They set up camp in the Hayden Creek area of Lemhi County, Idaho. Later that afternoon, Ray signaled to Ralph that he was going to move up higher on the mountain they were hunting on. When it began getting dark, Ralph returned to camp, assuming Ray would do the same. Ray never arrived back at the camp. Ralph and the other 2 hunters spent the following day looking for Ray. When they were unsuccessful, they contacted the sheriff, and a larger search involving more than 70 people, as well as search dogs, began on September 9th. In addition to the ground search, helicopters were brought in to look for Ray from the air. The search effort had to be called off after just a few days because of snow. It was briefly reopened a few days later when footprints were found on a ridge near the area where Ray had gone missing, but no sign of him was found. 2 days after his father went missing, Jeffrey Jones received a birthday card from him in the mail. I believed for a long time that he would be found. I kept hoping, and it was probably 15 years before I finally gave up. Rumors and stories kept circulating that somebody had seen him or that he took off. I heard all this stuff and just kept expecting or hoping that he would walk through the door one day, Jeffrey would later say. Ralph Pearson never used the bow he had been hunting with on the day Ray vanished again. It remained on the top shelf of his closet until he passed away in 2010, and possession of it went to his daughter Kendra. The last thing Ralph's daughter Karen said to him before he died was, "Dad, go find Ray." Ray would not be found until 53 years and 10 days after he disappeared. Around 4 p.m. on September 17, 2021, a bow hunter was taking a shortcut between 2 hunting areas when he came across human remains. He called the Lemhi County Sheriff's Office to notify them of his discovery. Because it was so late in the day, they were not able to come out to the site until the following morning. When they examined the remains, authorities found part of a wallet. Inside of it was the identification card of Raymond Jones. The bow hunter who found the remains has not been publicly identified, but he has spoken to Ray's family. "I'm very relieved to know what happened. I'm grateful to the guy that found him. I couldn't have asked for a better person to find my dad. After talking to him, he's just a super guy," Jeffrey Jones said after speaking with the hunter. Ray had told the other hunters he had wanted to look for mountain goats that day while they were back at camp. A large rock matching the type of rock that made up the cliffs above where the remains were found was found covering the lower half of the remains. The hunter who found Ray told Jeffrey that he believed Ray may have seen mountain goats at the top of the cliffs and then tried to climb up the cliff to see them better. Part of the cliff may have broken off as he did so and landed on top of him after he fell. "The past week and a half have been surreal, but I'm very lucky to know what happened to my dad after all these years," Jeffrey said after his father's remains were found. "I could have gone my whole life without knowing, but now I know, and it brings some peace." Jeffrey planned to bring his father's remains. Mervyn Sinclair was a Cree man from George Gordon First Nation in Saskatchewan. He had a happy-go-lucky spirit and loved to sing and play the guitar. He did not enjoy school and left after grade 6. He had an adventurous spirit and did not scare easily. In 1958, the 23-year-old was a private in Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Over the long Easter weekend, he visited family in Saskatchewan. However, when he arrived, he looked as though he had been roughed up, according to his family, and he drank heavily that weekend. Mervyn told his family that just prior to his Easter leave, a commanding officer had made a sexual advance towards him, which he had refused to go along with. The 2 men got into a fight which the commanding officer lost. Mervyn's father was a survivor of one of Canada's infamous residential schools, and he had taught Mervyn to box when he was young so that he would always be able to defend himself. That was not an uncommon thing happening to Native people. "I can believe that because I've watched it." Mervyn's sister, Darlene, would later say, "My father was a boxer, and he taught the boys how to look after themselves physically because we were Native people living off the reserve." Mervyn was concerned about what would happen to him as an Indigenous man on the base or in military prison if he were sent there because of the fight. He was also concerned that he might not even make it to prison as the officer had threatened him, saying, "You'll regret this once you get back." Mervyn's family believed he was still planning to return to Canadian Forces Base Wainwright in Alberta. He was last seen hitchhiking in Alberta. On On May 15th, he was declared absent without leave. Mervin's family learned that he was missing when military police arrived at Ralph's home looking for him. They initially arrested Ralph, believing him to be Mervin because of their strong physical resemblance. When the possessions Mervin had left behind at the base were returned to his family, his clothes were all covered in blood, increasing the family's fears that something had happened to Mervin on base that the military wasn't telling them about. Ralph Sinclair never gave up looking for his brother, even as decades went on without any leads as to what had happened to him. Ralph spoke to the media and posted handmade missing persons flyers throughout Western Canada. He died in the fall of 2020 without ever learning his beloved brother's fate. Just a few months later, however, a woman the Sinclairs had never met took a commercial DNA test and solved Mervin's disappearance 63 years after he went missing. Jelaine Davidson was raised by her mother and stepfather in Calgary, Alberta. She knew very little about her biological father. Her mother had left him and the home they shared in Hope, British Columbia, around the time Jelaine turned 1. Jelaine's mother wanted him to marry her, but he refused without ever providing an answer as to why. He was very secretive, which also contributed to the end of the relationship. Jelaine's mother told her that her father was a man named William Baca. He was Cherokee and from Oklahoma. His parents were named Victor and Nora. She did not have any further information about his background. In 1980, when Jelaine was a teenager, she was contacted by a mutual friend of her family and her biological father to inform her that William had been killed in a car accident. After Jelaine learned that her father had passed away, she also learned that he had tried to be a part of her life. Her grandmother confessed that he had written letters to her over the years, but she had thrown the letters away because Jelaine had been adopted by her stepfather, who had since divorced Jelaine's mother. She realized that she had made a mistake by doing this and apologized to Jelaine. It took Jelaine another decade to finally become ready to try to research her father and his family. Her mother was white, so she knew nothing about her Indigenous heritage but hoped to learn about it. She called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Terrace, British Columbia, where her father had died, to inquire about the car accident that had killed him in hopes that she could find further clues about his family. The officer she talked to happened to know a William Baca, but he was alive and working as a security officer at a local mall and younger than Jelaine. This William Baca, who went by Sam, was Jelaine's half-brother. Like Jelaine, he was also raised with a stepfather, but unlike her, he did know their father. The long-lost half-siblings got in touch, and Sam's wife helped Jelaine coordinate their reunion on Halloween as a surprise for Sam. Sam was able to show Jelaine pictures of their father and tell her things about him, like how much he loved music. The siblings visited their father's grave together, which gave Jelaine a sense of peace. Jelaine and Sam remained close despite not living near each other, speaking on the phone regularly and visiting each other when they could. Years later, when commercial DNA kits to test for an individual's heritage and identify their relatives who had also taken a, Jelaine was intrigued by the idea of this new potential lead in her search for information about her background. Fearing the effort would result in no answers, however, she was hesitant to take such a test for many years. Then, in February of 2021, Jelaine happened to see that Ancestry DNA was having a sale and finally decided to take the test. When she got her results, they identified a man whose DNA was a close match to hers and was most likely her cousin. When she looked at his family tree, she saw two familiar names, Victor and Nora, the names of her paternal grandparents. However, their last name was not Baca, as she expected, but Sinclair. Jelaine messaged the man and received a response from his wife who managed his profile. When she wrote back, she told Jelaine that she believed she was the daughter of Mervin Sinclair, who had been missing since 1958. She included Mervin's missing person flyer with the message. Jelaine was shocked when she saw the picture on the flyer. Despite the fact that the photo was taken almost 20 years before any of the photos of her father she had seen had been taken, she could tell that it was him. Jelaine messaged back with the photos of her father she had gotten from Sam and Mervin's one surviving sibling, his sister Darlene, was shocked to see the resemblance he still bore to the rest of his family later in his life. Another DNA match to confirm William Baca's identification as Mervin Sinclair was subsequently made through the The Sinclair family was disappointed to hear that Mervin had died in a car accident, but they were relieved he had not been murdered, as they had feared for decades. Others in his family continued to suffer as a result of government policies concerning indigenous people in the years after he went missing, so they could why he might have started a new life rather than face unjust repercussions from the military. They were thrilled to learn that Mervyn had 2 children who they were able to meet and welcome into their family. I feel like I will have a great deal of peace to have this sorted out for my dad. I just hope that, some way, somehow, he knows that we found him, we know his story, and that we love him, Jelaine told CBC News. Ranella Bernadine Large, who later became Ranella Dossett Leith, was born on October 25, 1948, in Knoxville, Tennessee. Her father, Dewey Ernest Large, was a nuclear scientist, and her mother, Annie Large, was a school teacher. Raised in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Ranella attended Oak Ridge High School, graduating in 1966. Oak Ridge was a secure and insular community built to support the workers at the nuclear power plant where her father was employed. As with any close-knit community, the residents of Oak Ridge were well acquainted with each other and had limited interactions with outsiders. Crime was minimal, and children could play outside without adult supervision or fear. The community was also very conservative and dominantly white. Although prohibition, a set of laws that criminalized the production and consumption of alcohol in the U.S., ended in 1933, alcohol consumption was strictly forbidden in the county where Ranella grew up. As a young girl, Ranella was very bright. She excelled academically, always at the top of her class and even taking extra classes when possible. Her safe and solid upbringing made her confident in her abilities and helped her excel in school. After high school, Ranella attended East Tennessee State University, Knoxville, where she trained to become a nurse. While in college, she met an ambitious and intelligent business student who wanted to attend law school after college and become a lawyer. Edward Dossett, also known as Ed by his friends and family, was a soft-spoken man with a friendly but handsome face. When he met the beautiful, dark-haired Ranella, it was love at first sight. Before long, he had asked for Ranella's hand in marriage, and she said yes. In 1970, Ranella and Ed got married and moved to Knoxville, just outside Ranella's hometown. Ed's family had a dilapidated but large farm in Knoxville with the help of an architect and rebuilt the farm so he and Ranella could settle down and start their own family. After Ranella graduated from college, she started working as a nurse in a hospital in Knoxville. By 1972, Ed had completed law school and began a career as a proud country lawyer. In 1982, the Attorney General for Knox County retired and Ed decided to run for the office. Ed brought his usual determination and enthusiasm into the campaign, and his efforts were rewarded when he got elected into the Attorney General's office. By 1978, Ranella gave birth to the first child, Maggie Dossett. And on July 18, 1983, their second child was born, a boy named Eddie. In 1985, Ranella gave birth to the couple's third child, a beautiful baby girl named Kate. When Ed served as the Attorney General, he had a secretary named Kay. Kay and her husband Steve were good friends of the Dossetts, and both couples often hung out together. But with the arrival of their child, increased pressure from Ed's job and Kay's first pregnancy, which made her resign from her secretary job. The four of them began to spend less time with each other, or at least two of them did. The other two, Ed and his former secretary Kay, continued seeing each other because they were having a secret affair. As an elected public servant in a conservative county, having an affair was perhaps one of the worst things Ed could do to ruin his career. But Kay, unhappy in her marriage with Steve, was in love with Ed. And as for Ed, one of the few things keeping him married to his wife was that leaving her would hurt his political ambitions. He was not exactly experiencing marital bliss. Almost everyone who knew Ranella and Ed knew that Ranella was not the easiest person to be with. She was bossy and controlling with a mean attitude that made everyone around her keep a distance from her. They knew not to mess with her. Ranella and Ed, who were once so in love with each other, started to have marital problems because of Ranella's controlling attitude. To make matters worse, Ed soon began to suffer from chronic stomach pain. Once at a local authority meeting, someone noticed Ed grimacing in pain and asked him if he was okay. Ed's reply was strange. He said that he had the meanest wife in the world who was trying to kill him. By October 1991, Ed's stomach pain had gotten so bad that he was admitted to the hospital. Shockingly, after a series of tests, the doctors informed him that there was a cancerous tumor in his small intestine and liver which had spread to other organs in his abdomen as well. Ranella took this news in stride, but for some reason she felt the need to hide Ed's illness from the rest of the world. Ed's diagnosis meant that he was dying already, and if word got out, he would have to resign from his job, losing his income. Perhaps, Rangila felt that by hiding the illness, Ed could continue working and beat the cancer somehow. But Ed only got worse. In March 1992, Ed's cousin Elizabeth traveled 500 miles from Illinois to come and see him. Ed, desperate to have his family around him, had written to her. When Elizabeth arrived at the Dossett home, she was shocked at the welcome, or lack of it, that she got from Ranella. Ranella bluntly refused to let her see Ed and didn't even allow her to enter the house. Upset, Elizabeth realized that there was nothing she could do, so she went back home. Later, she would receive a letter from Ranella, telling her that Ed was in such bad shape that he could not receive visitors. Gradually, Ed gained some energy that allowed him to return to work. Although in constant pain, he approached his illness with his usual determination. But despite his best efforts, Ed's condition worsened and he had to leave work again, this time for good. For the rest of his life, Ed remained bedridden, constantly pumped full of morphine to ease his suffering. On July 9, 1992, police raced to the Dossett residence after receiving a chilling call from a local market director. According to the director, Ranella Leith was claiming to have found her husband, Ed, lying on the floor outside unconscious. When they arrived at the scene, they met a hysteric Ramilla hovering around Ed, who was unconscious. She claimed she had found him there after he insisted on going down to see the cattle. She did not mention his terminal sickness. Rather, she told the operator she believed their cattle had trampled on him. From all indications, the only thing investigators could make of the scene was that it appeared to be an accident. But when police interviewed Ranella later, her story wasn't quite straight. According to her, Ed had suddenly insisted he go down to see the cattle. When he did not return inside on time, she went back to check on him and found him lying on the ground. She believed something must have set the cattle off because they were scrambling out of their pen. Even though she did not find a pulse when she checked for one, she immediately began CPR on him. Ranella then claimed that she tried to call 911 on her cell phone, but didn't get any response. So she ran back into the house to call the local hospital, but realized she couldn't remember the number. Police found this strange because Ranella had worked at the same hospital for years as the director of nursing. But since she had not been working for quite some time, they believed it might be possible that she had forgotten the number. She then called the director of a local market and asked him to call an ambulance. An ambulance did arrive soon after, so Ranella's story seemed accurate. When the ambulance reached the hospital, 44-year-old Ed Dossett was pronounced dead on arrival. The police launched an investigation into his death because they suspected foul play, but they ultimately agreed with Ranella's story and ruled the cause of his death as an agricultural accident. Although police had closed the case, not everyone was convinced that Ranella was telling the truth. People who had seen Ed in the weeks leading up to his death claimed that he was acting very strangely and could barely stay conscious for more than a few minutes at a time. He also found it difficult to walk straight, as if he was constantly intoxicated. It also seemed implausible that Ed's cattle would stampede him without any reason. Then again, autopsy reports showed that Ed had bruises, internal injuries, and hoof prints on his body, suggesting cattle had indeed trampled him. There was also the fact that Ed's life insurance policy had a double indemnity clause. So if he died by accident, his beneficiaries would receive twice the amount than any other cause of death. Since his death was ruled an agricultural accident, Ranella would receive that double amount. On top of all this, Ranella's reputation as a no-nonsense, bossy woman made people suspicious of her. She had told police that when she discovered her husband was dead, she was so enraged with the cattle that she grabbed a gun and shot one of them. But when law enforcement examined the cattle, they found none with bullet wounds. And interestingly, they also did not take note of the morphine in Ed's bloodstream, which would have been quite substantial since he was taking heavy doses of it to help with the pain. Despite these inconsistencies in Ranella's story, Local law enforcement did not pursue the issue any further. They also considered the possibility that he might have orchestrated the entire thing just so his wife and kids could have more money when he died, since he knew he didn't have much time left anyway. Ed's funeral was another strike against Ranella, as she decided to bury him on the farm rather than where his family said Ed had wanted to be buried. During the funeral, Ranella appeared too serene for someone who had just lost her husband and the father of her children. Some even said she was cheerful, moving from guest to guest as though it were a regular party and not a funeral. After Ed's demise, Ranella decided to become a full-time homemaker to spend more time with her kids, but she began to get bored or restless. So she began spending time with her children at a nearby pool owned by a man named Dave Leith. Dave was also Ed's friend and was generally well-liked in the community. He was married and had a daughter, Cindy, whom he absolutely adored. Apart from being married to people they didn't like and having children, Ranella and Dave had very little in common. While Ranella had a solid upbringing and was well-educated, Dave was a high school dropout with no other qualifications. After dropping out of school at 19, Dave found a job as a barber and eventually opened his own barbershop. He was fond of cars and always spent his free time tinkering with one or watching stock car races. But despite what some might have called his shortcomings, Dave was always certain of one thing. He was very handsome. Dave was not ashamed to spend extra money in effort to look good. He had undergone several plastic surgeries, including a facelift and a tummy tuck. And to an extent his efforts did pay off, because he was considered an attractive man by many. Unfortunately, Dave had an accident that subtracted from his beauty, at least by his standards. One day while chopping wood, he got a splinter in his left eye. To mask this defect, he took to wearing sunglasses to cover his eyes and never looking directly at people when he wasn't wearing the shades. The more time Ranella spent at Dave's swimming pool, the closer they got. Before long, they had begun having an affair. When Dave's wife found out, she immediately filed for divorce. But Dave didn't care. He was head over heels in love with Ranella. Little did he know that his love affair would be the biggest mistake he would ever make. In January 1993, 6 months after Ed died, Ranella married her boyfriend Dave in a tight-knit community like Knoxville. Marrying your husband's friend so soon after his death was scandalous, but the gossip soon died down as Dave and Ranella often walked around town, hand in hand, laughing and beaming at each other. They appeared to be genuinely in love with each other, and they were for a while. But just like her previous marriage, Ranella soon began to express her bossy nature with Dave, and this affected Dave quite negatively. For example, Cindy, Dave's only child, once found Dave sitting in his pickup truck sobbing. When she asked him what the matter was, he said he and Ranella had a fight, but it was nothing to worry about. In 1994, Ed and Ranella's last child, Eddie, died tragically in an accident. 11-year-old Eddie and his sister, 15-year-old Maggie, were driving around in their mother's car. Maggie had a provisional license, which meant that she could only drive when someone else with a proper license was in the car with her. On that fateful day, Maggie was driving unsupervised with Eddie in the passenger seat when Maggie lost control of the car and hit an oncoming vehicle. Eddie wasn't wearing a seatbelt then, and on impact he was ejected out through the passenger side and died. When police questioned Ranella, she claimed that she had been in the vehicle, although several witnesses asserted she wasn't. But the police took her word for it and did not press charges against her. Maybe if the police had done their jobs, some of the tragedies that occurred in the lives of everyone around Ranella would not have happened, because Ranella was not new to violence. Shortly after Ranella's son, Eddie died, Kay, Eddie's former secretary, sought a divorce from her husband Steve. During the divorce proceedings, Steve discovered that his second child with Kay was not his child. It was Ed Dossett's child. When Ranella got wind of this, she invited Steve to her house to talk about their partners and the whole situation. During their conversation, Ranella confessed that she knew about the affair, but had decided not to say anything about it. After their little chat, Steve went back home. The following day, Ranella invited Steve over again, claiming she had found papers that proved both of Kay's children belonged to Ed, not Steve. Naturally, Steve was curious, so when Ranella asked him to come over to see the documents, he did not hesitate. Upon getting to the Dossett farm, Ranella led Steve to a barn where she claimed she had found the documents. When they entered the barn, she pointed him to a bucket sitting in the corner. Ranella began firing at him with a revolver. She was now holding, but she missed the first few shots. Steve managed to escape the farm and immediately reported to the police. But Ranella, anticipating this, had called the police first. In a panicked voice, she narrated how Steve had come to her house with a gun, threatening to kill her. She knew this would make the police restrict Steve from seeing his children, which had been her plan all along. She wanted to take custody of the boy that Kate and Ed had together, but her story did not make sense. So she was charged with attempted murder and granted bail for $10,000. Her attorney tried unsuccessfully to get the charges dropped. But in January 1996, a grand jury indicted her. 2 weeks before she was set to face trial for attempted murder, Ranella went for a plea bargain, pleading guilty to assault. In exchange, the attempted murder charge was dropped and wiped from her record, and she got 6 years of probation and 100 days of community service. Meanwhile, Ranella continued to exercise more and more control over Dave. Dave changed his will and made Ranella the sole beneficiary of his estate after his death. Not even his beloved daughter Cindy or her son Dave's grandson would get a dime after he had passed away. He also ensured his mother's home would pass to Ranella after she died. In January of 2000, Dave began to suffer from some medical conditions, including hallucinations, high cholesterol, and even had a stroke once. Ranella immediately took charge of everything, forbidding everyone from seeing Dave. Not even his daughter Cindy was allowed to see him. However, Dave recovered from his illness and was discharged from the hospital, but he was forced to retire from his barbershop as he could not leave home for long periods. Alongside his many illnesses, they began to suffer from short-term memory loss and early-onset dementia. During one of his visits to a neurologist, he mentioned that he felt his wife was trying to kill him. He could faintly remember her pressing a pillow to his face. It sounded eerily similar to what Ed had said about his wife just a few months before he passed away, but his neurologist brushed it aside as one of his hallucinations. Meanwhile, Dave's mother was also diagnosed with ovarian cancer and had to be admitted to the hospital. On March 13, 2003, Ranella visited Dave's mother in the hospital. While there, she suddenly called Cindy asking if she had seen Dave. Ranella said she had left Dave's food on a bedside table, and she was worried he might have gone out without eating. Up until this point, Ranella had forbidden Cindy from seeing Dave, so the call seemed strange. But Cindy said she had not seen him. Ranella rushed home, worried that something might have happened to Dave. When she opened the bedroom door, she found Dave lying in bed, his food untouched. He had a bullet wound on the left side of his head, and there was no pulse. He was dead. When police arrived at the house, they immediately suspected foul play. Ranella had informed them that Dave tragically took his own life, but given his deep affection for his daughter and grandchild, he simply did not fit the profile for someone who would end their life so abruptly. Just a day before his body was discovered, Dave had offered to help a friend with some repairs. He seemed in good spirits even though he was in pain from his illness. As investigators interviewed Dave's family members, they found another reason to doubt Ranella's suicide story. Dave was afraid of guns. Even as a child, when his father took him hunting, he would refuse to use the gun to shoot any animal. He had never owned a gun as an adult, according to Ranella. Also, crime scene investigators discovered that 3 shots had been fired from the gun. The first one missed, the second one was the fatal shot, and the third also missed. The shots had been fired from Dave's left side, meaning he would have used his left hand. But not only was Dave right-handed, he was also completely blind in his left eye due to the splinter incident. So logically, he would not have used his left hand. Based on all this, the police determined that Dave did not take his own life. But if he was murdered, who did it? Without any further evidence, the case went cold. Much to Dave's family's displeasure, Ranella had Dave's body cremated. Cindy was devastated about her father's death. When she was invited to his will reading and she found out that he had not left anything to her and her son, she became livid. She accused the police of mishandling the case and pressed them to look deeper into it. She wrote to the DA's office severally, asking them to take another look at the case. The case went unsolved for almost 3 years, and she only grew more desperate to see justice served. By 2006, when it seemed like she would not get what she wanted, she hired private investigators and filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Reinella. Cindy wasn't asking for money. She only wanted Reinella to forfeit all the inheritance she got from Dave if Cindy won the case. The lawsuit made law enforcement look closer at not just Dave's death, but also Ed's. Upon further investigation, they discovered that the autopsy conducted on Ed Dossett's body was at the best not credible. Randall Bedigo, the medical examiner who had carried out the autopsy, had a long history of substance abuse, which meant that he was likely under the influence when he conducted Ed's autopsy. Otherwise, he might have noticed and mentioned that the morphine in his system, which according to the new medical report, was so extraordinarily high, it's unlikely that any human could function in an ambulatory manner or continue to live. In 2006, Reinella was charged with administering an overdose of morphine. It turned out that Ed had died from a morphine overdose, not being trampled by cattle. Investigators also discovered that before Dave's death, she had secretly gone to a funeral home to make an upfront payment for Dave's cremation. With this new information, the police were ready to make their next move. In November 2008, Reinella was charged with the first-degree murder of Dave Leith. Although she was arrested, police placed her bond at a ridiculously low $5,000. Yet there was no court date for her trial. In September 2007, Reinella entered a not guilty plea to the charge of Dave's murder, but she would not go on trial until March 2009. But the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a mistrial. It did not matter that of the 12 jurors, only one voted for not guilty, while the others believed she was guilty. She would go on trial again in 2010. This time, ballistic experts testified that the bullet that had killed Dave was fired from 12 to 14 inches away, which was too wide a distance for someone who allegedly committed suicide. Also, no fingerprints were found on the gun, suggesting that whoever fired the gun had the opportunity to wipe it. At the time of his death, Dave had up to 4 different medications in his system that would have made it impossible for him to sit up on his own, let alone hold a gun and fire it. The prosecution maintained that Reinella had killed Dave. She set it up to look like a suicide, then went to the hospital to visit his mother, where she was sure CCTV would provide her with a solid alibi. On January 25, 2010, the jury returned with a verdict after deliberating for 2 days. They found Reinella Leith guilty of first-degree murder of Dave Leith, and she was given a life sentence. The prosecution dropped all charges related to Ed's case afterward. In early 2011, a court ruled that Dave's last will was invalid because his illness implied that he was not of sound body and mind. Reinella had to give up half of everything she had inherited under the will. Reinella's lawyers tried to appeal the case, but they were unsuccessful. They tried again in 2013, but it was denied. By 2015, Reinella's new defense team argued that Dave's illnesses made him susceptible to depression and mood swings, which could have made him so depressed that he would take his own life. Also, they argued that the judge in the previous trial had been under the influence of drugs because of his addiction to narcotics. In January 2017, Reinella went on trial for the 3rd time. This time, the defense established the prosecution's case was circumstantial at best, and that there was every likelihood that Dave had taken his own life. Reinella was acquitted. We may never know why, but although Reinella Leith was dragged to the judicial system several times, she always came out on top, unscathed, and her victims were left to nurse their wounds privately. As long as she has lived in the quiet little community in Knoxville, nobody dares to question her or cross paths with her. Now, once again, Reinella Leith is free to resume her normal life as a mistress of a prosperous farm. Ed's family members will never know the true cause of his death. Cindy Leith may never get the justice she desperately needs for her father. As for the questions, we might never get answers. Fire Island, located just west of Anchorage, Alaska, near the head of Cook Inlet, became the focus of a grim discovery on July 24, 1989. Human remains were found on the island's northwest shore, but due to significant decomposition, the autopsy could only provide limited information about the individual. The remains were thought to belong to a Caucasian male between the ages of 35 and 50. An anthropologist was called in and concluded that the remains had been on the beach for at least a year before being discovered. However, an exact time frame of the John Doe's death could not be determined. Alaska State Troopers found evidence on the remains that indicated that John Doe's death was of a criminal nature, although details about that evidence have not been released to the public. Alaska State Troopers exhausted all means of identifying the remains available to them at the time but could not make an identification. The remains were eventually buried at Anchorage Municipal Cemetery. In 2003, the Alaska State Troopers enlisted the assistance of the FBI, submitting hair and tissue samples taken from the remains during the autopsy in 1989 and kept by the State Medical Examiner's Office. The FBI laboratory was able to extract mitochondrial DNA from the samples. The profile was entered into a missing persons database, but no matches were found. In 2021, the case was formally reopened by the Alaska Bureau of Investigation Cold Case Investigation Unit. The State Medical Examiner's Office had kept bone samples from John Doe's remains. These samples were then sent to Othram Inc., a private forensics laboratory in Texas. Scientists there were able to extract DNA from the bone samples. They then used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive DNA profile. This profile was used to conduct genealogical research. Several individuals, all linked to the same man by DNA, were identified. Some of these individuals also had ties to Alaska. Further investigation led authorities to believe that this man could be their John Doe. A DNA sample was then taken from a closed blood relative of this individual. The analysis of their DNA and its comparison to the DNA from the remains confirmed the match. On December 1, 2021, it was announced that the John Doe found on Fire Island in 1989 had been identified as Michael Allison Beavers. Michael was a heavy machine operator who lived in Chugiak, Alaska, and operated an excavation business there. He was last seen alive at the age of 40 in late November of 1979, when he left home to drive to Seattle to meet with a business associate. He never arrived. His wife reported him missing 2 months later. Little progress was ever made in the investigation into Michael's disappearance, and it was closed in 1982. Michael was declared legally dead 10 years later. The investigation into Michael's disappearance and murder is ongoing. Serial killer John Wayne Gacy made headlines following his arrest in December of 1978. The subsequent search of his home outside of Chicago located the remains of 29 out of his 33 known victims on the property, with the remains of the other 4 victims recovered from a nearby river. While Gacy's name became infamous, several of his victims' names remained unknown. 24 of Gacy's victims were identified by March of 1980. In June of 1981, the 9 victims who had still not been identified were laid to rest in donated caskets. A short service for all 9 victims was held outside of Abbey Chapel of the Oak Ridge Glen Oak Cemetery, and each victim also received his own graveside service when he was buried under a grave marker reading, "We remembered." Each victim was buried at a different cemetery. In May of 1986, one of these 9 victims was identified as 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy, leaving authorities with 8 individuals left to identify. In October of 2011, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart announced a renewed effort to identify the remaining 8 victims. They were all exhumed so that samples could be taken for DNA testing, and Sheriff Dart made an appeal to the public asking for friends and relatives of young men or teenage boys who went missing any time between 1970 December 22, 1978 to contact his office. The appeal quickly yielded results. The boy, previously only identified as Gacy victim number 19, was identified as 19-year-old William George Bundy on November 29, 2011. Bill's mother had feared he had been one of Gacy's victims and tried to get his dental records to submit to the police as they had requested back in 1979. However, his dentist had retired, and by the time she was able to track him down, he had destroyed all of his records. Bill was identified after his brother and sister provided DNA samples. In July of 2017, victim number 24 was identified as 16-year-old Jimmy Hackinson. His mother had gone to Chicago from her home in Minnesota in 1979 to try to learn if her son was amongst Gacy's victims, but she did not have dental records to submit to the police to identify him. He was also identified thanks to DNA submitted by his brother and sister. This left 6 of Gacy's victims whose identities were unknown. That number dropped to 5 on October 25, 2021, when the man, previously only known as Gacy victim number 5, was publicly identified as Francis Wayne Alexander. In addition to his extended family, Wayne is survived by his mother, 2 half-sisters, and 2 half-brothers. DNA extracted from one of victim number 5's molars had undergone 8 months of specialized testing and processing to prepare a profile suitable to be used with genetic genealogy. The Cook County Sheriff's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project for the genealogical research. Once the profile was prepared, researchers with the DNA Doe Project uploaded it to GeneMatch, a genealogical DNA database. The closest relative of victim number 5, located in GeneMatch, was eventually found to be his maternal second cousin. More distant cousins from both sides of his family were also identified. Because these relatives had such well-documented lineages, genealogists were able to identify Wayne as a potential candidate for authorities to investigate after only 8 hours of research. They submitted Wayne's name to the sheriff's office, and investigators there used more traditional means of investigation to follow up on the lead when they could not find any evidence of Wayne being alive after the time period when they believed victim number 5 was killed, which would have disproven the identification. They traveled to North Carolina to meet with his family. They collected DNA samples from Wayne's mother and brother, which confirmed that Wayne was Gacy victim number 5. Wayne was born in 1955. He grew up in North Carolina and lived in New York for a time. He got married while he was living there. Wayne and his wife moved to Chicago in February of 1975, but the couple soon divorced after 3 months of marriage. Wayne's family never filed a missing persons report because, based on certain decisions he had made, they believed he wanted to be left alone. While they loved him, they thought he no longer wanted anything to do with them when he stopped contacting them. Wayne supported himself by working at various bars and clubs in Chicago. Authorities do not know exactly how he and Gacy crossed paths, but Wayne lived and worked in an area where Gacy was known to look for victims. He lived near several other victims of Gacy, including William Bundy, who lived just blocks away from Wayne. Wayne would have been 21 or 22 when he was killed. The last official record of him was a traffic ticket issued to him on January 5, 1976. He was buried in Gacy's crawl space under an individual whose death authorities have placed on March 15, 1977, indicating that Wayne was killed sometime during the window of time between receiving the traffic ticket and the death of the other victim. Financial records show that Wayne earned very little income in 1976, potentially indicating that he was killed earlier on in that window. When investigators returned to the Alexander family to confirm that Wayne was in fact Gacy victim number 5 on October 22, 2021, there were 5 generations of the family in the room to hear the news. Wayne's mother was the first parent to still be alive to be notified that their son had been identified as one of Gacy's victims since the renewed effort began in 2011. The family greatly appreciated the kindness the people of Cook County had showed Wayne, giving him a proper funeral and burial, even though they had not known his identity when they did so. As upsetting as the circumstances of Wayne's death were, his family was grateful to know what happened to him and to have some measure of closure. At the press conference announcing Wayne's identification, Sheriff Dart read a statement written by Wayne's sister, Carolyn, on behalf of the family. It is hard, even 45 years later, to know the fate of our beloved Wayne. He was killed at the hands of a vile and evil man. Our hearts are heavy and our sympathies go out to the other victims' families. Our only comfort is knowing this killer no longer breathes the same air as we do. We can now lay to rest what happened and move forward by honoring Wayne. The statement read in part. On Sunday, October 5, 1980, 2 brothers were out driving near the Arroyo Grande Wash, south of State Route 146, in Henderson, Nevada. Around 9:20 p.m., in a then unincorporated area of the desert, the 2 brothers came across the nude body of a young woman along the side of the road. The young woman's autopsy would reveal that she had died of blunt force trauma to the back of her head. A roofing or framing hammer was the most likely instrument to cause her particular injuries. She also had severe injuries to her face and puncture wounds to her upper back. Her death was ruled a homicide by the Clark County Coroner's Office. Given how easily she was seen when she was found, authorities did not believe she had been left in the desert for long, or that her killer or killers had tried to prevent the discovery of her body. It was estimated that she had been killed within a day of being found. Her body had been washed and cleaned, and part of a shower curtain was found nearby. The young woman was 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed around 100 pounds. Her age was estimated to be between 14 and 19 years old. She had shoulder-length, reddish hair. She had a small birthmark on her lower back and a homemade tattoo of the letter S on the inside of her right forearm. These details did not lead to the identification of the young woman. She was referred to by police as Jane Arroyo Grande Doe as they continued to investigate her murder. They took her fingerprints but found no matches, as well as X-rays they hoped could also help identify her. Despite their efforts, both her identity and the identity of her killer remained unknown for decades. John Williams was the homicide detective on call the weekend the young woman was found and began working on her case that evening, ultimately becoming the case's lead investigator. He continued working on the case in an official capacity until he retired in 2006 and unofficially after his retirement. He was one of several members of the police department who contributed money to give Jane Arroyo Grande Doe a proper burial and buy her a headstone. He and his wife visited her grave and brought her flowers every year. "I'll never not work on it. We're basically the only family she's got," Williams said in 2006 in a news article written in honor of his retirement. Jane Arroyo Grande Doe was exhumed 4 times in 2002, 2003, 2009, and 2016 to collect more evidence for further forensic testing. More than 30 missing women were considered as potential identities of Jane Arroyo Grande Doe over the years, but they were all eliminated. The case was formally reopened in 2015 in honor of the 35th anniversary of the case. John Williams went with Detective Joseph Ebert, the currently detective on the case, when he visited the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children about the case. NCMEC released a new artistic representation of Jane Arroyo Grande Doe, and artist Carl Koppelman released another rendering of her in 2018. With dental records, fingerprints, and conventional DNA searches failing to identify Jane Arroyo Grande Doe, police in Henderson turned to genetic genealogy. Luckily, one of her relatives in California had taken a commercial DNA test and showed up as a partial match to her DNA in a genealogical database. This relative put authorities in touch with the man ultimately determined to be Jane Arroyo Grande Doe's grandfather in Arkansas. He told investigators that their victim had sisters. 2 of these sisters provided DNA samples, which ultimately confirmed Jane Arroyo Grande Doe's identity. At a press conference on December 2, 2021, 41 years after Jane Arroyo Grande Doe's body was found, the City of Henderson Police Department's investigative division announced that she had finally been identified as 17-year-old Tammy Terrell of Artesia, New Mexico. Tammy was born on July 4, 1963. She was one of 4 sisters who were raised in a foster home. In September of 1980, she was staying at Assurance Home, a youth group home in Roswell, New Mexico, trying to get her life in order. On September 28th, she and another girl living at the facility were dropped off by a staff member at the New Mexico Fairgrounds where the Roswell State Fair was being held. When the staff member returned to pick up the girls, Tracy was not there. Tracy was seen later that evening at a Denny's in Roswell with 2 adults, a white man and a white woman. Police believe they may have been planning to leave New Mexico and travel to an unknown location in California. According to Tracy's youngest sister Carla, police were not interested in investigating Tracy's disappearance when she first vanished because she had run away before and would be turning 18 in less than a year. Tracy's family did not give up on looking for her, however, looking at the faces of homeless people and people in crowds wherever they went for the next 4 decades, hoping to one day see Tracy's face. Carla plans on visiting Nevada in January of 2022 to visit her sister's grave and meet with the investigators who remain so committed to Tracy's case. Despite recently being hospitalized, John Williams was present at the press conference announcing Tracy's identification. The investigation into Tracy's murder remains open. In 2021, 59-year-old François Barrev was living in Le Grand Mot on the southern coast of France. On September 27th, He informed his wife that he was heading to a vacation rental property they owned in Grabs du Roy to check in new tenants. After kissing her goodbye, he left home on his bicycle and never returned. His wife later discovered from his computer that no one had rented the property. She reported him missing, and he was not found until 2 days later. On September 29th, his body was discovered at the rental property, along with 2 notes. One note indicated that his death was a suicide and requested that he not be resuscitated if his attempt failed and he instead fell into a coma. The other note contained a confession of terrible crimes and the killing of innocent people. A DNA test from his body confirmed that Francois Barrev was the notorious serial killer, Legrelli, who had evaded identification for 35 years. Legrelli was suspected of committing 3, possibly 4 murders and 6 rapes between 1986 and 1994. His first known murder was the 1980 killing of 6-year-old Cécile Bloch. Cécile lived with her parents and older half-brother in the 19th district of Paris. An accomplished student and talented violinist, she had played with a youth orchestra for several years and was planning to transfer to a specialized school in 1987 to continue her studies while also attending a conservatory. Monday, May 5, 1986, began as an ordinary day for the family. Cécile's parents left for work at 8:10 a.m., and her half-brother, Luc, who was studying advanced biology, left 5 minutes later. Cécile was scheduled to leave for her morning classes at 8:40 a.m. She typically returned home for lunch at noon before heading back to school. Her mother, Suzanne, would call home to check on her. On May 5th, however, Cécile did not answer the phone as usual. Suzanne waited a few minutes before making a second call, which also went unanswered. She then called Cécile's school and learned that her daughter had never made it to class that morning. Both of Cécile's parents then rushed home to look for Cécile. When they arrived, Cécile was not there, but her school bag was not either, meaning that she left for class but did not arrive there for some reason. Cécile's parents enlisted the help of one of the building's caretakers to search for her. Around 3 p.m., the caretaker was searching a utility room on the 3rd level of the basement when he discovered Cécile's body underneath a piece of discarded carpet. Cécile had been raped, strangled, and stabbed once. Her body was also marked by scratches and bruises, indicating how fiercely Cécile had fought against her killer. Police quickly had a potential suspect for the horrific crime. Several witnesses, including Cécile's parents and her half-brother Luc, saw an unfamiliar man in the building, both on the elevator and in the parking lot, one level above where Cécile's body would later be found, between 7:50 and 9:20 that morning. Luc in particular got a good look at this man and had reason to remember him. That morning, he rode the elevator with the stranger as he headed out for the day. He remembered him not only because he did not recognize him from the building, but also because he was unusually friendly for someone he did not know. Luc assumed the man was just visiting someone else in the building and therefore thought it was unusual when the stranger told him that he hoped he had a very, very good day as Luc exited the elevator. Luc described the unknown man as being between 25-30 years old and just under 6 feet tall. He also reported that the stranger's face had very textured skin, either from pockmarks or acne scars. This detail would lead to the moniker the killer would be given while his identity remained unknown, La Grille, or the pockmarked man. A composite of the suspect was generated but did not lead to the identification of Cécile's killer. Her case was closed and reopened several times with numerous individuals re-examining the details of the case, but Cécile's family remained frustrated with the progress of the investigation. After completing his studies, Luc became a geneticist and pushed for authorities in France to use DNA technology in his half-sister's case, as authorities in the United Kingdom and Belgium had begun doing in some of their investigations. It would take years, but eventually, semen found on Cécile's body was submitted for DNA testing and a profile was developed. This profile would ultimately link the pockmarked man to 3 other rapes and 2 other murders. The first crime DNA tied him to was the rape of an 8-year-old girl called Sarah, which occurred the month before Cécile was killed. Sarah entered the elevator in her apartment building on the morning of April 7, 1986. A man was already inside of the elevator and pretended to press the button for the first floor for her. Instead, the elevator went down to the 4th level of the basement where the man pushed her out of the elevator. He pulled her over to a mattress and punched her twice as she struggled to get away. He stuffed a rag in her mouth, raped her, strangled her, and left her for dead. Luckily, she was only rendered unconscious and woke up approximately 15 minutes later after her attacker had fled. The same DNA was also found at a double murder which occurred shortly before the first anniversary of Cecile's murder. 20-year-old Umgard Muller was from Germany but was living in Paris, working as an hauteur and studying geography. Her employers were 38-year-old Gillis Belitaire and his wife. Gillis was an airline mechanic who worked nights while his wife worked during the day. On April 29, 1987, Umgard, who lived in a maid's apartment not far from the Polity family's apartment, arrived to take their daughter to school at 8:45 a.m. Mrs. Polity then left for work. Her husband had not yet returned home from his overnight shift at work. She would not see him again until 7 o'clock that evening, when she would discover his body when she returned home. Jill's body was in a position called a Spanish tourniquet by the authorities. He was on his stomach with his arms behind his back. His arms, legs, and neck were all connected with various ties and pieces of fabric from within the apartment. The various pieces were tightened with a poker from the fireplace, and he would have suffocated slowly. Mrs. Poulatier then found Umgard's body in her daughter's room. Umgard was mostly nude and tied up to the bunk bed in the room. She had been strangled with the tie from a bathrobe and her throat had been cut. Both Gillis and Hermgård's bodies had been burned with cigarettes and showed superficial knife wounds, indicating that they had been tortured. The Polite's daughter was thankfully not at the apartment. The parents of one of her friends had taken her home with them when Irmgard failed to pick her up at school. DNA would be found inside Irmgard and on a cigarette but found inside the apartment. Both samples matched the DNA from Cecile and Sarah's crime scenes. 2 cameras were stolen from the apartment, and Polaroid paper found at the scene indicated the killer may have photographed his crime. It is possible that Umgard actually knew her killer. A man was seen at her residence the day before and the day of her murder and was seen having a heated discussion with her. According to witnesses, he had severe acne scars, raising the possibility that he was the pockmarked man. If this is the case, it means these 2 murders could have had a different motive than Cecile's murder and Sarah's rape. The next crime tied to the pockmarked man through his DNA occurred on October 27, 1987. A 14-year-old named Mary and returned to the apartment building where she lived with her mother from school for her lunch break. A man followed her into the elevator and told her he was a police officer and needed to see her identity documents. He showed her he had a gun and a holster under his jacket and demanded to see her arms to check them for track marks, claiming he was investigating drug trafficking. He continued making threats against her and asking her questions about her mother and her schedule. Now knowing she would not be at home, he forced Mary inside her apartment and tied her up, threatening her with a letter opener while asking about valuables in the home. He gathered 2 cameras, a VCR, a CD player, and 14 CDs into a bag before coming back to Mary and then raping her. The man tried to wipe his semen off of Mary Ann's body, but some of it would be found on the bedding. In 1997, a DNA profile was developed from it and found to be a match to the pockmarked man. The final crime where the pockmarked man's DNA was identified occurred in 1994. Unlike his other crimes, it did not occur in Paris, instead beginning in Mitrimoy and concluding in Saclay. On June 29th, an 11-year-old called Ingrid took a shortcut as she rode her bicycle home after playing with her friends. As she rode down an isolated dirt road, a car pulled up in front of her and blocked her path. The driver exited the car and told Ingrid that he was a policeman, briefly flashing a tricolor card, a type of identification card issued to law enforcement officers to her. He told Ingrid that she was allowed to be riding her bike on that road and asked her for her identification documents. She did not have them with her, so he told her he would have to take her to the police station. The man handcuffed Ingrid and put her in his car, refusing to let her stop at home to tell her family where she was going. Instead of taking her to the police station, the man drove to Saclay, more than 60 kilometers away. He took Ingrid into an abandoned farmhouse, where he raped her. Ingrid spoke to him the entire time, a fact to which she would later attribute her survival. Her attacker again wiped away his semen from her body. He did not have a chance to dispose of the tissue, however, because he left Ingrid at the farmhouse, telling her he was going to get food but would be right back. Ingrid was able to escape during his absence and came across a class from a local motorcycle school. The instructor took her to the gendarmerie in RC, and evidence from the farmhouse was quickly collected. In addition to the crimes with DNA evidence, the pockmarked man is also suspected in other crimes based on the circumstances surrounding them. In 2015, police software that analyzes the elements of various crimes led to the pockmarked man also being suspected in the murder of Corinne Leroy, who disappeared in Meaux while walking to school on June 9, 1994, 10 days before her 20th birthday. Her body was discovered near the edge of a forest by people out on a walk on July 12. While DNA evidence has not been found tying her death to the pockmarked man, her body was found, bound in the same distinctive manner as Gillis Polity. Corinne also disappeared just 20 days before Ingrid was kidnapped and, like in Ingrid's case, also disappeared from outside of Paris, where the pockmarked man's earlier known crimes were all committed. She also disappeared from a main road where a struggle would have been noticed, indicating that she most likely got into someone's car willingly, either because she knew them or perhaps because her killer had told her he was a police officer as well. The pockmarked man was believed to have committed 6 rapes between 1986 and 1994, as well as numerous other attempted attacks. For example, on November 26, 1987, for young women between the ages of 14-19 reported being approached in their apartment buildings by a man with a tricolor card claiming to be a police officer and demanding to see their identity documents. Luckily, in these 4 cases, the girls either got away on their own or their parent or some other trusted adult unexpectedly arrived to assist them. The incidents all occurred right after each other, with 2 of them occurring within the same building, as though the man spontaneously tried approaching victims of opportunity after each failed attempt to gain control over a girl. The incidents were either suspicious or upsetting enough for all of the girls to report them to the authorities. The 4 girls, as well as 5 adults who interacted with the man, identified him as the man pictured in a composite image of the man who raped Mary and just a month earlier, tying the pockmarked man to these incidents. Several of the adults who had interacted with this man speculated that he was only pretending to be a police officer as, despite the identification card he flashed, he did not seem to have the confidence or composure of an actual police officer. However, as years went on without the pockmarked man being identified, investigators became more and more convinced that his claims of being a member of law enforcement were not just part of a ruse. Certain details did point to the pockmarked man being either a police officer or a gendarme, a member of France's military police. Some circumstances seemed to make the latter possibility the more likely, such as his vocabulary, the types of knots he tied, and the tactics he used, as well as the proximity of gendarmerie facilities to some of his crimes. He also seemed to have some sense of forensics, making some attempts to prevent leaving behind DNA before the average member of the public would have understood its forensic value, and wiping down items at crime scenes that would have had his fingerprints. He was obviously not always successful in removing all of the forensic evidence, but the absence of such evidence at some crime scenes has prevented them from conclusively being tied to him. The possibility that the pockmarked man truly had been a gendarme led to an investigating magistrate opening a massive effort to search for the killer amongst their ranks. In 2021, 750 men, who had been gendarmes in the Paris region at the time of the crimes, were ordered to report for questioning and to provide a DNA sample. Farouf learned he had been ordered to report through his wife, who used his old cell phone number. On September 24, 2021, she told him that she had just received a phone call meant to inform her husband that he had to report in 5 days and instructing him to call back to receive a time for his appointment. She told him that the commander who called said that the summons was in relation to a reopened investigation relating to events that occurred between 1986 and 1992. She would later say that she noticed no change in his mood or behavior when he received this news. He left home 3 days later and was found dead of a suicide by overdose on the day he was due to report for questioning. Farouf served as a gendarme stationed in the cavalry of the Republican Guard between 1983 and 1988. He went on to become a member of the police force until a motorcycle accident forced him into early retirement in 2014. Between 1993 and 2000, he lived in Lanfrey, a 15-minute drive from the site of Ingrid's abduction and a 30-minute drive from where Corinne Leroy went missing. According to Verov's wife, who had been married to him since 1985, they had a harmonious marriage and her husband never got angry. His identification as the pockmarked man also shocked his neighbors, who described him as a helpful, normal neighbor. He has been described as a typical police officer who acted professionally and had a good sense of humor. However, he did have mental health struggles in the later half of the 1990s, which required him to take time off and seek treatment. The second suicide note, which was addressed to Verov's wife, has not been released to the public in full. It has been reported that he did not provide details about the crimes which he acknowledged committing. He blamed his crimes on impulses that stemmed from events in his childhood and claimed that his wife and children were the reason he gained control over them and stopped killing. He claimed to have committed suicide to protect his family, knowing that his crimes were about to become public. It has also been reported that Verov claimed to have committed no crimes after 1997 in the letter. This is concerning because the last crime attributed to the pockmarked man occurred in 1994. Investigators are currently looking into more than 20 crimes, trying to ascertain if Verov had any involvement in them. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.